Well, hello. I'm delighted to be able to present today. And as you know, I'm always interested in Dorchester history. So now I'd like to share a little bit. But we're going to talk today specifically about a 5-year period from 1869 to 1874. And the vote to annex Dorchester to the city of Boston occurred in June of 1869. And then annexation took place on January 1st of 1870. And so we're going to talk about the anticipation of annexation and what followed thereafter. Now, Dorchester uh, history may need a little explaining up to that point. So first of all, we're going to talk about the period from the Revolution through the Civil War. And in the period right after the Revolution, the Dorchesters and Milton, in fact, their river mills started to produce more for the export market than for the local markets. And so that was the beginning of real commercial industrial activity in Dorchester. And somewhere in the 19th century, Dorchester transitioned from an agricultural community to a commercial and industrial community. So I'm going to try to share my screen and see if we can start this. Let's see. I'm going to go with slideshow. From beginning. And if
That's good.
you can see that. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the title screen, of course, and we have an illustration of Savin Hill in the mid 19th century. Uh, Again, an agricultural landscape. But as I mentioned, at some point, Dorchester did transition to the commercial industrial activity as being its greatest source of wealth. And yet, the agricultural fields remained open and orchards, so the Codman orchards, and even dairies. And dairies lasted right into the 20th century. So we know that by 1870, however, Dorchester was no longer a truly agricultural community. Now, the Neponset River Mills were really the precursor for the American Industrial Revolution. We're going to look at some of the early villages. So the first two villages in Dorchester were Meeting House Hill and Lower Mills. And you can see them located here on the Dorchester map. And here's an 1839 view of Dorchester at Lower Mills. So a view from Milton toward Dorchester over the bridge. And so it was a densely populated area already. And then, of course, Meeting House Hill had been the religious center of Dorchester from the 1670s when the church building was moved there by oxen from the corner of Pleasant Pond and Cottage Streets. And so from thereafter, Meeting House Hill, it was the religious center. And, still has not only First Church, but St. Peter's Catholic Church there at that location. So still could be considered a religious center. And then more clusters of housing came in, and we added Port Norfolk down at the right, Commercial Point and Harrison Square there in the middle, and then over toward the west, where we had a subdivision for Jones Hill. Now, Port Norfolk, because of the introduction of the Old Colony Railroad in the 1840s, grew quite rapidly by 1850. And here at Commercial Point, the Newell and Niles, whose mansions are sitting right in the middle of this painting, planned commercial activity at Commercial Point. It wasn't terribly successful, but there was a cluster of housing here. And then Mount Bowdoin, there was a subdivision plan in Mount Bowdoin early on in the 1840s, and that's why we show it here. And these lots, as you can see, are the ones that were set out at that time. But even by 1874, it was not very densely populated. So Before we go into the rest of the presentation, I want to talk about some of the housing styles because that will be key for our later discussion. And so many of you would recognize a hip roof, and you can see the design on the left, but then the William Clapp House on the right will show you how shallow a normal hip roof is. In the mid 18th century, mid 19th century, the popular style was the Italianate. And you can see on the left the wide eaves and the brackets under the eaves, and also the arched windows. Those are features of the Italianate. In this, the traditional Italianate style is a boxy, squarish house, but you'll see that many of the styles get adapted in Dorchester and other cities into more vertical buildings. And then the mansard roof, or Second Empire, sometimes called French cottage style house, has a roof line that has two angles. In this example, we have a curved edge to the roof on that third floor, and then the smaller angle above that. So this is a gambrel roof, and you can see the construction. So what is the difference between a gambrel and the mansard roof? Well, both have the vertical, quite vertical sides at the beginning of the roof, and then the shorter and the lesser angle at the top. But with a mansard roof, that profile goes all around the house. It's not just front and back, as you see in the example here. Now, we sometimes have a hard time deciding when a roof is a hip roof and when it is a mansard roof. And it all depends on how vertical the angle is at the edge. And so here you see it's somewhat shallower, less vertical, but not as shallow as the original picture of the William Clapp House. So I call this one a mansard. Others might call it a hip. And so this is the mansard roof that goes all around on every side. So you can see that here. And some have the curved profile on the edges and some have a straight line. But this is the more typical house that we're going to see today in our period from 1869 to 1874. And so now I'm showing you a map near Meeting House Hill, and toward the lower left, you can see the name J. Gassett. And there's a bracket after his name, and he owned 3 houses which he built. And this is typical of the construction that happened prior to annexation. All the way through the 19th century, the family might subdivide their own property and build a house for one of their children, or a developer like Mr. Gassett might buy a small parcel and put up a few buildings. What changes in 1869 is the number of lots in a subdivision. People are buying very large acres and acres of land and subdividing it to many lots, often of uniform size, and then putting up houses of uniform style. So Mr. Gassett built this house, and I'm calling this Dorchester's most famous house. And here we have a chance, if you'd like to put a comment in the chat, can you tell me what house this is? So I'll give you just a moment. And I'll ask if we're getting questions in the chat, because I'm looking at my presentation and I can't see the other screens.
We have a few people guessing the original This Old House.
And they are right. So that's the way it looks in its refurbished state. And so this is very much like many of the houses we're going to see today. And it is in that mansard roof style, a later version of the Italianate, and adaptation from the Italianate. We still have the wide eaves with the brackets underneath. And then we have that third floor, or sometimes second floor, roof profile. That's very common in our period. It seems to be the style that builders knew and could put up quickly. But as I said, that this is typical of the earlier subdivisions where only a few houses were built. So in the late 1860s, early 1870s, all of these circles, ovals, represent a subdivision plan with many lots. Now you see how Dorchester was ripe for development because of the railroad lines. Along the coast, the red line along the coast is the Old Colony Railroad. And on the left, it's the Fairmount line today. Along the southern border, it was the Dorchester and Milton Branch Railroad. And from Neponset over at the right to the middle area is no longer in use today, but the left-hand portion is part of the Mattapan trolley line. And the line in the center that changes direction, that curves, is the Ashmont line, or originally the Shawmut Branch Railroad. So Dorchester was well served by transportation, and that allowed developers to have hopes when they started subdividing. Our first subdivision, and I'm only going to look at a few, I'm not going to look at all of them because that would take hours and hours. But our first one is at Fields Corner. You see Dorchester Avenue at the left of the screen at the bottom. And so this is behind, let me think, the Bank of Boston and the post office. And the street that runs beside the post office, next to St. Ambrose Church Complex as well, is Leonard Street. And I have an oval here for the lots at Leonard Street, down toward the end, toward Clayton Street. Now, these lots were purchased from the Pierces and redeveloped, subdivided into these tiny lots of about 1,520 square feet each. And so then a two-story house filled the front half of each lot and had a living area of about 1,550 square feet. And we see here all of these in a row, attached row houses that were built with mansard roofs. Most of them are covered in vinyl today, so we don't see their original condition. Here's the back. You see the backyard is equal to the size of the house. And typically we have these very decorative porch or brackets under the porch roof, or entry roof, I should call it. And so that is typical of the style at the time. And this developer came in and decided that he could make his most money with these modest, perhaps entry-level houses, quite small, packed together, and sold for the least amount of money. We have a very similar house on Buttonwood Street, and you see one behind it as well. This has the full mansard around all four sides, and again, part of a larger subdivision. Again, you can see those brackets under the front porch entryway. Now, if we move down to just below Ashmont Street, Ashmont is the horizontal street here. I have circled the Bailey Estate and the E.W. Robinson property. Now, the Bailey Estate was about 9 acres that fronted on Dorchester Avenue, and Robinson's land was another about 20 acres facing Washington Street. And so the land from Washington Street to Dorchester Avenue now have Bailey and Fuller Streets through them. The Bailey Mansion, a federal era mansion, so-called, looked like this. So it has on the right-hand side of that house, you can see the federal era appearance, like 5 windows, and would have been a doorway there. Now it has its entrance on the street side, on the back side of this photo. The land was subdivided. Some 3-deckers were put in front of this house before Dorchester Avenue, so it no longer has a view of Dorchester Avenue, but this was the Bailey estate home, originally with 9 acres. So in 1870, um, the Bailey and Fuller Streets plan came out. Uh, Benjamin Newhall bought the 9 acres from the Bailey estate, and his father-in-law, Enoch Fuller, bought the remaining 20 acres toward Washington Street, and they combined the land and produced this subdivision plan. So you see how we have these regular lot sizes. I've circled the Bailey home there. It did not have the 3-deckers in front of it. At this point, it still had a view toward Dorchester Avenue. But so this is typical of what was going on, these huge, I say huge, but at least subdivisions with dozens and dozens of lots ready for construction. And we see this is the kind of house that still exists today in these neighborhoods. And throughout Dorchester, you'll find these. The 2-story, French cottage, Second Empire, mansard roof style, and various varieties. And here's a picture of one of the original houses. It was taken down and replaced with the Bailey Street School. This one was a double house. But also we do have the Italianate style buildings being built at this time. So you see this one is a vertical expression of the Italianate. You can ignore that addition on stilts to the left that's gray in color. That is a later addition. The main house would have had the bay on the side, the bay on the front, the decorative brackets under the entryway door. And here at the eave, of course, we have the brackets under the wide eaves, and we have the oval windows, the arched windows. Now, these windows appear to be replacement windows. The windows themselves are rectangular, but they've retained an arched wood molding to replicate the original appearance. Now, if we go up to northern Dorchester, there is a Carson Street subdivision. And again, we see these same houses as all the others. So this was the typical style that builders built. It probably most economical for them, quick to build, and were selling rapidly. Yeah, at least that was their hope. Some of them did go back to the Italianate style. This one's has a flat roof, so a little more boxy in appearance. But again, same wide eaves, brackets, and then the front entryway with the more decorative brackets. And a subdivision plan on Milton Avenue west of Codman Square, we see all of these houses being developed, or lots being developed, and then houses being built. And at the left, you'll see the proposed depot for the railroad line. That's the Fairmount line, which now is not in that same position, but you see the importance of transportation to the development that was going on. And on Milton Avenue, we still have 9 of these left, and this is another example that is so typical of the period. We have a bit more decoration here around the windows in the mansard roof piece than in some of the other examples. And so east of Dorchester Avenue, across from Fuller and Bailey Streets, there was a subdivision of land that was purchased from Cheever Newhall, who was Benjamin's uncle. And so Cheever sold this land, and then it was subdivided, and it reached all the way from Dorchester Avenue to Caruth Street. The railroad went through the middle of this, so at that time it was not underground, but the station was there, or the north side of the intersection at that time, actually. So these house lots were planned, and was for a much more upper level category of house. So 3,500 square feet of living space, and 3 floors now, not just the 2 that we've seen in the more modest houses and middle income houses. These were for the more well-to-do, and also in the Italianate style. So not the mansard roof style, but here we have again, the brackets under the eaves. And again, our porch entry has now developed into a much larger structure with a cornice and brackets under it, just matching the eaves above, which the eaves above have a more squarish bracket, or we would call them perhaps a modillion, but all of them are still typical of the period. And Parkman and Dick Street, Benjamin Newhall again came in, and we have some even more fancy houses. This one has originally a single family house with not over 9,000 square feet of living area. And another 3,000 square foot house. So these were for the more well-to-do. Now the Mill Street house here that's pictured is quite grand. It was built in this period, but it was not part of a new subdivision. It was infill housing for the surrounding community. And in Brook Avenue, we have our first example of brick row houses. These are quite rare in Dorchester. It's not something we typically see on our streets. There are just a few examples, but you can see on the left, the designs of the front entryways of these row houses. And then again, on Stoughton Street at the bottom of the map, that is now Dudley Street. You see that there were bricks along there as well. So this is 124 to 132 Brook Avenue. And you see it again, the mansard roof style. And Grant Street, that should be 1 to 7 Grant Street. And here we have a magnificent example of the corner at Pleasant Street and Savin Hill Avenue of all these mansard 3-story row buildings lining up. So it's quite a grand appearance. So I'll summarize now. And so for the first time, starting in 1869, developers subdivided large tracts of land into similar sized lots. And then they built these houses with similar design. Most likely, there were no architects involved, but builders knew what they were doing, and these houses were so similar in style that they knew how to frame every one. Now, one of the reasons the period ends so quickly from 1869 to 1874 is that credit dried up, the availability of credit. So as a result of the Great Fire of 1872 in Boston, there was a drain on available credit lines. And then the Panic of 1873, which lasted until 1879, gave the country its first real depression. And so the money just was no longer available. Many of these houses went into foreclosure. In one example, 5 different owners bought the house in the space of a year, all assuming the mortgage that the builder put on the property at the beginning, and that house went into foreclosure. So people were speculating that they would make money selling for a few $100 profit, and the next person assumes the existing debt, and of course the price goes higher and the debt remains there, and the last person in line thinks he can sell or she can sell or perhaps rent the property, but then there was no one around to buy or to rent. So they lost the house to foreclosure. This was not atypical. But construction would pick up again in the 1880s, and we'd have where we would see now all of those wonderful decorative styles that come later, the Queen Anne, the stick style, shingle style, colonial revival in the grand houses that we call the Victorian era houses in Dorchester. So now we can move on to questions. Happy to answer them.
So we have somebody raising their hand. Gonna unmute them so they can ask.
Okay, so you're unmuted if you have a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, what was the purpose of the building the row houses?
I think that you could get more houses into a particular land area than you could with houses that have yards. And it seems as though there must have been some market for it. This is a popular style in the South End and in Roxbury and even in Charlestown. So it's a rare example in Dorchester, but I think it's just making property, the population more and more dense because you can make more and more money off um, of getting more units into the same amount of space.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to Robin Kirkpatrick. I'm gonna unmute you so you can ask your question.
Thank you so much for the chance to ask a question, and the talk has just been fascinating. I was curious to know if it happened to be the case that as Dorchester is developing in that period, are the people who are buying the homes in these different neighborhoods of Dorchester typically coming from one or another sections of the city? In other words, like, are people, in the same way that nowadays people move from the South End to neighborhoods in Dorchester, as an example? Was that also part of the pattern in that period?
Well, it was Boston. One of Boston's desires to acquire Dorchester was the need for housing. Uh, Not only was the population growing, but the city planned to demolish a lot of housing, that's particularly down toward the Leather District in that area, because they wanted to put in the commercial industrial facilities that we see the remnants of today. And so those people would all need to move, and Boston really wanted them to move to a part of Boston, not to a different town. Uh, Dorchester had been urban for a very long time. In fact, in the 1850s and 60s, Dorchester was one of the 100 largest municipalities in the country. And, even after annexation, it was said that Dorchester, if it were a separate town, would it still have been in that category. Uh, so it was already a town, and it would have been a separate uh, development. And Boston didn't want those people's taxes, I guess, to go elsewhere. They wanted to be able. But the other reason for annexation, or another reason, was that Boston needed a route to Dorchester Bay for its sewage lines. And eventually the pumping station at Columbia Point was built. The sewage went out there, going deeper and deeper and deeper as the sewage pipes went down to allow the flow. And then when it reached the pumping station, had to be pumped back up so that it could go through the outfall tunnel and out into the bay. Luckily, that no longer happens. But so there were various motivations for Boston to acquire Dorchester, but most of the population, well, I would say much of the population were displaced people who were going to have no place to live. So they had to find a new housing. And it was seemingly fairly, uh, there was an ability to buy a house at that point. People were earning enough in order to be able to afford the monthly payments, so they didn't need to rent anymore, which is what they had been doing in these large tenements in Boston. So opportunity for everyone, I guess.
Okay, we have another question from William Kuttner. I just unmuted you if you want to ask.
Okay. Hi. Yes, going way back at the beginning, Earl, you were talking about industrialization and mills. Were the mills tidal powered, or was there flowing water that they could, or were they steam? What was sort of the power profile of the early mills?
Well, so there were 17th century tide mills, but the first mill in Dorchester was a river mill on the Neponset River. And certainly all of the huge wealth that was generated came from the Neponset River mills. And they improved once the Mother Brook was developed in the 17th century that allowed water to flow from the Charles River to the Neponset. And so there was even more flow in the river, and a great place for the, as they say, the precursor to the American Industrial Revolution. It was really the prime example of what could happen and then did happen. And so these were river mills until steam power came in. Certainly some of them switched to steam in the mid 19th century, but they also improved some of the water power mechanisms, like moving to tub mills, the early version of the turbine, so that they had more efficiency in their production. And so it was the river mills, essentially that made the fortunes here. And by the mid 19th century, Dorchester was producing tons of chocolate furniture. I mean, you should see thousands of tables every year in the census that were put out, and used carts for horses and all of those other services that go along with things like that, the painting, the castings, all of that. So it was a really wonderful, well, I say wonderful, it's easy to idealize these things later. I'm sure there's a lot of pollution as well as things were being produced.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Another question from Joanne Teller.
Hi, thanks, Earl. And there's a question in the chat from Adam Johnson that mirrors what I was going to ask, which was maybe for some more information about the vote itself, and particularly from the Dorchester side. Like, so Adam asks, were there political dimensions to annexation? Were there forces against it? Did people from Boston try to convince Dorchester folks, about the benefits? And I'm curious what the result of the vote was, and was it binding?
Well, yes, the vote was binding because it had gone through Boston and through the legislature, and then only required a vote by Dorchester citizens. So the vote was binding. It was a narrow victory for annexation. Those in favor of annexation were many who were interested in subdividing property, as well as all of those other Boston reasons for acquiring Dorchester. But the people who lived in Dorchester, there was a split between sort of the old guard, in fact, large landowners who really would have and did reap the benefits of annexation, but were against annexation. They were traditionalists. They tried to influence the vote. They had town meetings where they were, well, at least at the legislature, there were comments critical of the town meeting selectmen for trying to influence the voters by appealing to their traditions as opposed to the opportunities. So it was kind of a rear guard action. I don't know. I suspect that the population had changed a great deal. I know it changed a great deal during the 19th century. So we have the large traditional English background people who owned land, and then some very wealthy merchants who came to Dorchester and bought up estates as well. And these large landowners, I think, were afraid of change or didn't want it in their own backyard. Who knows what that was all about. But then you have the great proletariat, if you will, the people who work for a living, and they may have been more interested in the services they could get, improvements everywhere, like sidewalks and streetlights and who knows what else. And just at that time, of course, is when gaslighting, coal gas lighting came in. And so the Dorchester Coal Gas Company and the Boston Coal Gas Company were putting in lights, and it probably was an attraction to go for annexation. There was a huge, of course, influx of Irish immigration in the 1840s and 1850s, though I don't have any sense that there was a subdivision of the vote along any kind of ethnic lines. But it just meant that Dorchester was growing quite rapidly. The population of Dorchester was probably 12%, 13% Irish, of Irish origin by 1870, which was a big increase for one town, that much all at once. But Dorchester did have a huge outflow every year of citizens and a huge inflow from all of the New England states as well as other countries in this period. So it's just not the traditional puritanical, if you will, descendants who were still there. There was a huge variety of people already in Dorchester in 1870.
Earl, we have another question in the chat that's somewhat related. So Ed Frechette says, so all these new homes were occupied by owners and not renters?
Not all. Some developers built buildings and rented them. And it's not clear whether that's because they couldn't find a buyer or because that was their intent from the beginning. But there's certainly a percentage of homes occupied by renters as well as by owners. But the great majority were purchased. So the typical pattern seems to be that the builder would acquire a large tract, subdivide it, and then as the houses were built, he would mortgage each one. So you could put a $1,500 mortgage or a $2,000 mortgage on the house after it was built. And then he would sell to a new buyer for $1, which means that he had already gotten his money out of the mortgage. And now the new buyer had accepted payments on the mortgage. So they didn't need a down payment. They only needed to be able to afford the monthly payment. And we've seen that as time went on, many of them could not. So the original mortgage was foreclosed. Now today, of course, the builder who had a mortgage foreclosed in his name would receive bad credit. But at the time, this was just the way of doing business. There was no real credit reporting for these. I mean, there was credit reporting available for large companies and merchants, but not for local builders. And so no one got a bad name because a mortgage they had taken out a year earlier or 2 years earlier wasn't being paid by the new owner. It was just the expectation that the new owner was the responsible party and they would lose their house if they didn't pay, which indicates that there was a huge confidence in the value of property because the lenders would have to believe that they could recoup their money when they foreclosed. And I guess many of them had deep pockets because they had to hold on to these houses for many years before they could resell them. In the late 1870s, it started to pick up a little bit, but then in the 1880s, the economy came back, so they were able to sell. And maybe they had found a tenant who maybe didn't pay the equivalent of a full mortgage payment, but would pay something, so they didn't lose all their money. But it was a troubled time, not unfamiliar to all of us who lived through the early 2000s here. What happens in the mortgage industry?
We have another question, but their name just says iPhone. So if you want to
Okay.
ask, you can go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you guys talked about displacement. What about the homeless people in the 19th century? Were there any resources for them?
I don't know a lot about the homelessness situation in the 19th century, but every town had a poorhouse, if you will, if you want to call it that, a charitable workhouse, maybe even, where the poor were placed. And those who couldn't make it on their own did have this place where they could stay. I don't know anything about the conditions there, but Dorchester was already always proud of its almshouse. I'm not sure what happened after annexation. Uh, Dorchester also paid to have any of the insane cared for in institutions, the various institutions around the state. And so they would place people there and take it as a public expense to be paid for out of taxes. So it seemed as though there was at least a mechanism for taking care of people. I don't know how successful it was. I don't know any stories of homeless people on the streets at that time. It certainly, it's a little easier to live today in a car than it would have been at that time to just live outdoors, where people didn't have a shelter. So I don't know it though. I don't know any history there.
So there's no almshouse today. You have Pine
Not in,
Street and you have the
not in
Rosie's
Dorchester.
Place.
I don't know
No more.
no, I think we don't have those same institutions today. We have just payments to people for, welfare and other public assistance that people can find, food stamps, that kind of thing. But, we do have a huge problem with homelessness today.
Mm. You have a lot of, mental illness, people that want to work and don't, you can, and, it just goes on and on.
It does.
So,
And I don't think I'm not familiar with any sources that would tell us about the 19th century.
We have another question from Maureen Conway, if you want to ask.
interesting.
Hi, quick question. I just want to confirm that I heard what you said, that the seat of the church moved from Pleasant and Cottage Street to Meeting House Hill. I'm assuming the congregation moved. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, Dorchester's first church was founded in 1630, and the congregation became a congregation on board the ship Mary and John before they left England to come to America. And that congregation came here and established their church in Dorchester. Then in 1635, there was a split with part of Dorchester's residents traveling off to Windsor, Connecticut to found that town, and they became a church there. And there was an argument and even a legal case about which church was the true Dorchester church. And the one here in Dorchester was determined to be the true Dorchester church, even though its minister had gone off to Hartford or to Windsor, Connecticut. So Dorchester was in search of a new minister, and Richard Mather emigrated at that time. And so he was chosen as the new minister. So he was not the first minister, but he was certainly the most famous and influential minister that Dorchester had in the 17th century. And so the first church building was up near Columbia Road, what is now Columbia Road, in that stretch near Pleasant Pond and Cottage Street. So in that general area. And in the 1670s, and I think this was actually the second building that got moved, but in the 1670s, they took the building and the congregation went along as well and just dragged it up to the top of Meeting House Hill. And so I don't know if they received a gift of land or whether they purchased a better spot, but certainly the top of a hill seems appropriate for a church as we look back today, more than just down on the flat land. But at first settlement, they didn't settle on the top of Meeting House Hill. They settled around there from the burial ground in Upham's Corner over toward Pleasant Pond and Cottage Street. In that area, they settled on Savin Hill, and then everyone else was kind of an outlier. So it made sense that the church was there at the beginning, but then as the town grew, the church was moved. And then later on, of course, in the early 19th century, the political center of the town moved to the geographic center, which is Codman Square. And so the town hall was built there.
Oh, interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Susie Istock had her hand raised, but it's not anymore. But she also has a question in the chat.
It was the
Um,
same. It was just what was asked. Where
Oh,
where was
okay.
the political center? So I lowered it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
We have Sean Wright. I'm going to unmute you if you want to ask your question.
Mr. Taylor, you showed a couple of house plans for the Pierces and a couple other ones there, okay, that showed a lot of mansard roof houses together in like the 1870, 1872, 1873 period. How did they have so many mansard roof houses together right there? And how were they able to deal with like horses that they would have sold those houses to that families would have brought in? Because now all those houses are really condensed. And some of these families I would think would have like horses and weren't completely relying on public transportation. So how did they deal with the services besides like the horses, like the sewage, the water, stuff like that in such a densified house plan at that point?
Okay, so of course the larger areas where lots were much larger, the owners were able to put in stables, except in a few examples where the developer of the subdivision put in some restrictions that said you can't have a stable here. So in that case, and in all of those cases, they were public stables. So for instance, in Fields Corner, the Fields family operated with something like 50 employees in a stables there that not only people traveling used, but the local people used. They would keep their horses there and then have their kids run around and say, hey, we're going to take the carriage out today. We need the horse, you know. So this was fairly common. All up and down Dorchester Avenue, for instance, there were public stables. And then in the western side on Washington Street.
Good.
We have another question from iPhone again, sorry.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, how did Dorchester get its name, and who did decide about the name of the name of the streets, like Columbia Ave, Dorchester Ave? How that come about? Who arranged that, the name of the streets, and how did Dorchester get its name?
Okay, well, to start with how Dorchester got its name, it's from Dorchester, England, because many of the original settlers came from Dorchester, England. Dorchester, Watertown, and Boston were all named in September of 1630. The Dorchester immigrants, whichever way you look at it, arrived in June of 1630, in early June, and didn't have a name for their town until September, or an official name at least. They called it Mattapan at the beginning. And then Boston, the people who settled Boston went to Salem first and then moved south. So they arrived a few months later for Boston to settle there. And so by September, Watertown and Boston and Dorchester were ready to name themselves, I guess, and get permission from the legislature or the general court at that time for the naming. And Dorchester was one of the largest taxpayers at that time to the colony. The Dorchester's land stretched at that time almost to the Rhode Island line, so it was a huge territory that many, many towns came out of over the years. Then the street names are, sometimes it was a popularity contest, I guess. Certainly the people who were constructing or paying for the roads were able to name them. And in many cases, at least later, it was the landowner. So Fuller Street is from Enoch Fuller, who developed that subdivision. And the Bailey Street is from that old Bailey owner, even though he didn't develop the street. It was Benjamin Newhall and Enoch Fuller who developed those two streets, but they chose the names. And I think the city is fine as long as someone else is paying, that they'll let you name it. Though I believe there is a rule that you can't name a street after a living person. At least today there is. And I think that may have a few exceptions. But for instance, when Charles Dickens visited Dorchester in the late or 1860s, there was a desire to name a street after him, and they couldn't. So we have Charles Street and we have Dickens Street. We have two streets named for him.
Earl, do you know
Interesting.
the somebody wants to know, how did Mattapan get its name?
Well, it's a Native American name, and there are various interpretations of what it means. And some people have said it means the good place, and others that it means the pestilential place. So I have no idea what the truth is, but you know that due to European visitors, many diseases that Native Americans didn't know and hadn't been exposed to came to New England and wiped out 90% of the population. So that when the Dorchester settlers arrived, they were facing mostly empty territory. And that's how they were able to just walk in and settle. They had a few Native American neighbors, and at least in Dorchester, I think the chief was amenable, friendly, and so on. And they accepted that friendship in return and gave back what he gave. So it was more pleasant here than in many other parts of Massachusetts. And certainly we have the later Indian Wars in the 1630s and then the 1670s. But Dorchester was spared from that.
Some people have been answering other people's questions in the chat, so we appreciate that. But Earl, do you know what the population of Boston was before Dorchester was added in 1870?
I don't. Not off the top of my head. Sorry.
And
You know
some other, oh, go ahead.
Roxbury had just been annexed a couple of years earlier. So they found that to be a successful transition, or at least they said they did. And so that was part of the impetus for more annexation. Of course, it just could have been imperialism as well. The desire for more power for everyone, I'm not sure.
And I think we have time for one more question that's in the chat already. It says, considering Native American origins, does Dorchester have an official land acknowledgement?
Do you mean a deed? I'm not sure exactly what a land acknowledgement is, but there was a deed from the local Neponset chief, Sockham, to Dorchester as an entity of the land. So I have no idea how that was negotiated, whether there was any remuneration for that deed or not.
I think Jen Cardy actually can help with that. Hold on one second.
Oh, good.
Jen, you're on mute.
So, yep, thank you. Just for context, a land acknowledgement is a recognition of the native origin of the lands that people are operating on. And a lot of organizers within the Native American community have been asking municipalities and other entities to, before events and other types of community gatherings, to sort of bringing in that fraught history to current awareness and having people sort of sit with some of the complicatedness of how our communities came to be. Dorchester doesn't really exist as an independent political entity anymore, and I'm unaware of any Dorchester-wide work on land acknowledgement. I think that would be something for Boston to be doing as a whole at this point. And I'm also unaware of that happening. But First Parish Dorchester has worked on and developed language that we've tested out a few different versions of, and is using a land acknowledgement at the start of services each week at this point.
Oh, could you share that someday with me?
Yep, I'll grab it from our order of service and paste it in the chat.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how much time we have left, Earl, but there are a few more hands going up.
Well,
Okay,
go ahead. Let's go ahead.
So Sean Wright, you're unmuted.
So Earl, with the impact of annexation, okay, it's obvious to see that the 1870 annexation spurred quite a few families to go out and do this. What do you think the meaning of the impact is even today? Because whether it's Dorchester or New York or certain other places, every place starts as farmland, and then what we see today kind of comes from it.
Well, it's all about money, isn't it? It's development because people can make money. And I think most of us would prefer to have 2 or 3 acres of land here and lord it over our own yards. But we couldn't afford such a thing in the city of Boston anymore. And I think that just happened gradually over time that, as people needed money, they would subdivide and subdivide and subdivide. And it has come to the point where, of course, you can only buy a small piece of territory for anyone. Or at least the normal people I know can only buy a small piece of land or even a condominium. So we no longer have in the cities, I mean, it's just the growing population, the demand for housing. It's just inexorable, I guess.
And the last question, Mary Carbonara, you're unmuted.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Jen Carty's explanation of the land acknowledgement, which was excellent. I have attended events, lectures and events that do a formal land acknowledgement. I feel it's a very important ritual to do. And most notably, I've attended this year Boston Public Library and National Park Service joint lectures. Their lectures, most of them have begun with a land acknowledgement that the land we are living in came from, was taken from Indigenous people. And so I have attended events where the land acknowledgement is now a routine thing. And most notably, the Boston Public Library joint lectures with the National Park Service have been doing that at the beginning of their talks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. And Jen did put in the chat the First Parish's land acknowledgement for if people want to take a look. Obviously, it's something that warrants more discussion on the part of a lot of different organizations and entities. I think we're a little over an hour and people have asked really good questions, and Earl obviously provided a huge amount of information that we can all take with us. And as you go around Dorchester, you'll see some of the houses and streets and areas that were developed that he talked about, and hopefully it'll sort of help us all understand a little bit better, what Dorchester was like 150 years ago and how it's evolved since then. So thank you, Earl, very much.